Turn over to Matthew chapter 20 is where we're going to be. Matthew chapter 20, as we go through Stewardship Month here and continue with our second week on Growth Group. We have growth groups that meet during the week. So if you're looking to get even more connected, more invested in other Christians' lives, if you haven't figured this out yet as a Christian, you've got to invest yourself, make a choice to sacrifice to be around other Christians. I said to our growth group on Wednesday, which you've heard me say before, I'm sure, that the church, if it's done right, the way that Jesus wants it to be done, the way He commands us, He shows us in His Word, if it's done right, it is the world's greatest treatment center. Because when you come into the church, you don't always just need people who struggle the exact way you do. I also need sometimes people who struggle differently so that they think of life in a different way than I do. And the church is comprised of all of us seeking to love the Lord, put Him first in our lives, be honest that we're still sinful and broken, and we need help. And we have that accountability. And what happens when we do that? We grow, right? And I think that's evidenced in even Emmy's testimony of just the depth of choosing to invest yourself with a group of believers. And I hope that maybe that might be one of the first steps that you're thinking about here is, man, maybe this is a church I want to get connected with. Maybe it's a test for me this morning. Emmy had me under a test. I didn't know it. Maybe you're testing our church here this morning. But that makes sense in some ways because you're looking for a church where you can invest with your family. Maybe you've been coming a while and you're thinking, I'd like to know more, even more about the church. Well, we're going to be starting a membership class on March 9th, which is basically just an information class. You're not obligated to join. It's a class where you can get to know even more of what our church believes, who we are, and how we function. And so that's an option there for you that you'll hear more about. So Matthew chapter 20 is where we're going to be as we continue Stewardship Month. Now, stewardship might not be a word that you think of very often. You might think of it as maybe someone on a plane who's helping you on your flight, or a steward in some way, like a waitress or waiter. And stewardship, when you think about it biblically, is just managing. It's a manager. So the word manager that we use today is what the word stewardship means. And when we talk about stewardship as a Christian, a person doesn't decide to become a steward after they've been saved, nor after he begins to make good money or something like that. When a person comes to Christ, they're a steward. Because when you become a Christian, you are a manager. You come to realize, I've been living for myself, I've been doing my own thing, living as if I'm the God of my own little world, playing in the sand. And when you come to know the King of the universe, you humbly bow down and you lay it all at the Master's feet. And you say, out of gratitude, what can I do for you? Not because I have to, but because of what you've done for me. What can I do? Now, Genesis, when it speaks of man being created, it says man shall have dominion. Man and women shall have dominion over the earth. So we are created. We saw this last year in stewardship. I looked at that text. We are created for stewardship, to be managers of God's resources. Now, I ended last week the sermon asking this question, that what if God sat you down, maybe you've thought about it, what if God sat you down for a management review? What if He sat you down to have a review over what you've been doing with His resources, His time, His talent that He's given you, and the treasures that He's entrusted to you? That's something humbly each one of us have to ask before the Lord as a Christian is, how well would that go? No doubt we know that we can't be perfect because that's why Jesus came, is because nobody's perfect. And so Jesus came to give us life and forgiveness. But at the same time, out of gratitude, how well do you think that would go for you? How well would it go for me? It's a question to ask yourself. And as we make our way into Matthew chapter 20, we're going to look at another parable. So this month, we're going to look at 5 different parables that relate to stewardship. And we're going to look this morning at the parable of the vineyard workers. And as we do that, we're going to address this idea as we go throughout, that kingdom work must be driven by the joy of receiving God's free grace. Perfect love, as we've seen in Growth Group, we've been going through 1 John, walking through some of that. And do you remember, those of you that have been coming to Growth Group, that in 1 John it says that perfect love drives out what? Do you remember? Fear. True, godly, Christ-centered love is not a love driven by fear. That is not related to Christianity. So any system or denomination that teaches that you are to obey God simply out of a slavish fear does not understand the gospel and does not know Jesus. We don't serve Jesus out of fear. We serve Him out of joy. And kingdom work that he does call each of us to do, which does not save us, it doesn't get us into heaven, but he calls us to it. It must be driven and motivated and fueled and ignited by the joy of receiving God's free grace. What did you do to earn God's forgiveness? Nothing. You just simply brought your burden and he said, put it on me. I'll take it. You simply received something that which you could not earn. No human being will get to heaven and say, I'm so glad I got here. I'm so glad I got here. No, just humble servants who recognize without Jesus we have nothing. Nothing. Nothing at all. And so what do we do in the here and now? Well, my joy must give way to actual service to the King. If it's not, something's wrong. And we know this intuitively. Like, if I say I'm super jacked about something, but I don't actually have any way I could evidence that I'm giving myself to that thing, you would say, I don't know if they really like it as much as they say they do. There's a lot of Christians like that, aren't there? That they may sing at hands raised and feelings flying, but when push comes to shove, are they really working for the master? Well, I'm sure we've all been guilty in some way, haven't we? But kingdom work, it's got to be driven by joy. Not fear, but joy of the fact that we have been given the greatest gift. You might have saw that I posted this on our church Facebook, that 1 ounce of Christ's love is greater than a ton of earthly treasures. We have found that to be true, haven't we? So what do we do now? We serve Him. We serve Him. We do the kingdom work, but we do it in joy, even when it's hard, because our joy is not driven by a feeling. Sometimes my joy is driven by, I know that this is the right thing to do. We joke about this in growth group, because sometimes we've all had moments where like, oh, I just don't know if I can make it tonight. I'm wasted. It's that midweek, I don't know if I can make it to the support group, the growth group. And then when you get there and you get invested and you're kind of rebuked by the Lord. You're like, this is where I needed to be. I'm so glad I came. And you leave refreshed. Sometimes that's the way kingdom work is. We don't live by our feelings, but it is driven by a deep-seated joy of God's free grace through Jesus Christ. And so now, as we turn over to Matthew 20, I'm going to give you the points, and then we're going to walk through them individually. This is to explain the parable. Jesus spoke often in parables. He used stories that on the surface will kind of draw you in and bring you to a point where you're like, this is where I am in this story. I agree with this. And then all of a sudden, Jesus turns it on a head, and He helps you see that it's not just about an earthly story. It's about a kingdom reality. And He's drawing you in with this illustration. And in Matthew, if you read through the Gospel of Matthew and the other Gospels, you will find, starting about Matthew 13 or so, that Jesus starts to say, the kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like. And He uses these metaphors. It's like it's a pearl of great treasure. And when someone found it, he sold everything he had. He sold it all. The house, the dog, the cat, the car, the truck, the boat. He sold it all so he could get this pearl of great price. That pearl of great price is Jesus. He's trying to draw you in to say, what is this? Who is this? What is He talking about? The kingdom of heaven is like, and for those who have ears to hear, and the Spirit of God drawing on them, they'll understand that this is no earthly story. This is a heavenly reality. And so as we walk through the parable of the vineyard workers, we're going to see the master, the laborers, the wages, and the response. And so instead of just reading it all at once, we're going to walk through it together, starting in Matthew 20. Now, Jesus is getting closer in the Gospels here to His death. And He has said now a few times to His disciples, I am going to Jerusalem to die. But the disciples, like you and I, we don't always get it. We're always a little distracted by earthly things sometimes. And so Jesus is now explaining, because off the heels of this, if you see in Matthew 19, you might see a heading there that says the rich young man. And now there were no chapter headings in the Greek, so in reality, the chapters should have actually gone from Matthew 19:1 all the way down to 20, if you ask me. Because what you see is that Jesus is continuing a discussion in Matthew 20 of which He was already having. A rich man came to Jesus, said, good teacher, what must I do to be saved? You just tell me what I got to do and I'll do it so I get to heaven. And Jesus knew that this young man was trusting in his own goodness. He thought he was a very moral, good person. And he could compare himself to other people. And Jesus said to him, I'll tell you what, go sell everything you have and come follow me. And then you'll start to understand what the kingdom is like. He was trying to pry the idol of money out of his hands. But he didn't get it. He went away sad because he didn't realize he worshiped. He disobeyed the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. He loved money with all his heart. So he went away sad. And Peter, at the end of chapter 19, he sees that, so the rich man's making his way off, and Peter, the apostle, known to be kind of the spokesperson for the disciples, he looks and turns to Jesus and he says, hey, we've left everything to follow you. I mean, Peter had a wife. I mean, think of the dynamics of that, of leaving his wife behind for 3 years to follow Jesus around. That was difficult. Peter turns to him and says, we have left all of these things to follow you. What will there be for us? And Jesus said to him in verse 28, truly I say to you, in the new world, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes. And then he says in verse 29, everyone who has left houses, brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or lands for me, because they love me, will receive 100-fold and will inherit eternal life. But then, verse 30 says, but many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. Now, Jesus is going to continue this because if you look at chapter 20, verse 20, he says it again. Or verse 16 of chapter 20, he says the last will be first and the first will be last. So he's continuing this contextual conversation because there was a mindset of the disciples that, hey, we were one of the first people to follow you, therefore we should be able to receive the most reward. And Jesus is now going to illustrate to them, no, I've enlisted you to work for me, but you don't work for that way. You don't work for rewards. You don't work because you're better than, or you can look down on. You are enlisted to be a servant in my kingdom because you love me with all of your heart. That's why later on, after Peter denied Jesus, what did Jesus say to him 3 times? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? It was all to be driven by joy, love, and gratitude, not one-upmanship, not I got here first. So let's see what Jesus has to say as we look at what the master. He says, for the kingdom, this is verse 1, so please follow along. Matthew chapter 20, verse 1, for the kingdom of heaven is like. Okay, so he's signaling that you're going to get an earthly story with a heavenly reality. We are introduced to a master. For the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. So we're introduced to a master. It's very common in the first century. If you look it up, about 10, possibly 20% of the first century population in Rome were slaves. So think about that. 10 to 20% of the population were slaves. And there were a group of individuals who kind of owned large things, vineyards, and they were enlisting people for work. And there were also times where people were not slaves, but they were looking for work to feed their family. So we're introduced to a master. We don't know what kind of master this is yet. We don't know if he's a harsh master. We don't know if he's a generous master. We're going to find out. The kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house, and that word signifies that this was a very important person who owned a lot of property, more than just a vineyard. He had a lot. And he managed all of it, and he enlisted managers underneath him. So he says, a master of a house went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyards. This is seasonal work. So when harvest time came, you needed possibly more workers. So we're thinking right away, the master needs workers. He needs workers. But what you're going to find, just to kind of signal it for you, I don't think he really needed the workers. He's just super kind to people who are hurting. He's super kind to people who don't have work. He's super kind to the people that get passed over and say, you ain't going to work for me. So he goes out early. He initiates seeking workers for his vineyard. And he goes out early in the morning, and as you'll see that in the first century time, they split the day up into 2. time periods of 12 hours. So the day started about 6 a.m. The sun kind of decided the day's work and, of course, when the night was. And so 6 a.m. was kind of the start of the workday. So he's probably up early. He's probably up around 4:30, 5 o'clock, getting himself ready, and he's going to go to the public place where individuals stand and wait to see if someone will hire them. And we'll find out more as more about the master. The kingdom of heaven is like a master. Now we look at the laborers. They enter the scene starting in verse 2. And he goes down to the laborers looking, and it's 6 a.m. is when this is. So 5:30, 6 a.m. He's got a 12-hour workday, and so he finds some guys who are there early, and they're there first. I don't know if there's a line. I don't know. They're doing push-ups. Hey, hire me. After agreeing, verse 2, with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. So, we're introduced to the first set of laborers that start at 6 a.m. They're going to work a 12-hour day from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And so he agrees with them that he will pay them a denarius. Now, just to keep in mind, a denarius is simply a day's wage. So basically, when you think of a denarius, it's not that complicated. We could go into the history of it, but just think of minimum wage. Think of what the amount a person would make in one day. Because when a person worked in the first century, they didn't get a paycheck at every 2 weeks or 1 week or whatever, and no salary. You work and you got paid at the end of the day. So your entire life was based on, I got to work today so that at the end of the day, I'm going to get paid by this master and I can go home and feed my family. That was the thread by which you lived upon in the first century. I got to make just enough to provide my family for today, and then we'll worry about tomorrow, and then stuff like that. And so, the Lord and the master, which you'll see represents God, as we'll see in the story, he goes out and he hires those at 6 a.m. And he tells them that I will give you a denarius. And so they go out into the vineyard to work. Start out in the cool of the morning. Those of you who've been to Israel, very cool in the morning. If you're there in the hot time and it gets very hot, often take a break in the later part of the day. But then there's more about the laborers. If you look at verse 3. And going out, so the master's not done yet. He didn't just simply go there early, okay, I'm done. He keeps going back for more workers. So verse 3, if you got your Bible open or it's up on the screen, and going about the third hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. Now, just to give you a signal, the first group of people were the only ones who understood what the master had said. Hey, I'll give you a denarius. You work the 12-hour day, I'll give you a denarius. But the others that come after, he just says, trust me. I will do what is right. And why is he doing that? Because they're not starting the workday at 6 a.m. like most people. They're starting the workday later. So here in verse 3, he goes out the third hour, which is 3 hours later from 6 a.m., so this is about 9 a.m., right? So at 9 a.m., he goes back down there and he hires more people. And he says to them, I will do what is right. Just trust me to do what is right, and I'll take care of you. So these guys are going to work from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. They're the 9-hour shifters. And in verse 4, he said to them, you go into the vineyard too, in verse 4, and whatever is right, I will give you. So they're just trusting like, well, he seems like a nice guy. I mean, I know I'm not working a full workday here, but I'm just going to trust he's going to take care of me because I got no other job right now, so I'm going to take it. You just take what you got. So then he goes on. You think, okay, is the master done with workers? No, he goes back. He stays or goes back. We don't know which. And he goes back to hire more people. You see, in verse 5, so they went out in verse 5. And verse 4, he said, you go into the vineyard too, and hired him at the third hour. And they went out going again. And then he went out the 6th hour. The 6th and the 9th hour. So this is at 12 p.m. and 3 p.m. So they went out to the vineyard, and the master went at the 6th hour and the 9th hour, and he did the same thing. He hired people. It's starting to get weird if people are observing the master. Like, why are we hiring people this late in the day? It almost seems like, now think about this with me. Why are those guys standing around? Is it because they don't want to work? No, they're there. It's because people have probably passed over them. They have looked over the crop and they thought, well, that guy's ripped. That guy's doing push-ups. That guy I know does work. That guy looks strong. No. And these people have been left behind. But this master is different. He's not like an earthly master. He goes back and he starts choosing the ones that everybody else passes by. And he says, you go work in my vineyard. I don't think it's because he needs workers, by the way. I think it's because he loves people. And he sees that they have families. And he sees that they're hurting. And he sees that if no one helps them, what are they going to do? How are they going to survive? So he's driven by his love to go back and help more people. And so he hires them. They're going to work 6 hours. In verse 5, these guys are working 6 hours, and they're only going to work 3 hours. And what he says is, trust me. I will do the same. I will take care of you. Certainly, he's done. The day is almost over. But what does the master do? We're starting to get this idea of what kind of master this is. This is a kind and gracious master who loves people. The day is almost over. He probably could find better things to do. There's probably busyness which he could spend his time. But look at verse 6. About the 11th hour. The 11th hour. Now at that time, like I said, they're splitting that up in 12. So 6 p.m. is quitting time. What's the 11th hour? That's 5 p.m. 1 hour left of work. I remember one of my first jobs was working at Subway down the street. Before I had turned 14, I was 13 years old. My mom had worked there, so who knows, maybe I had an in. But they don't hire you at 13 anymore. But I started working at 13, and I became a sandwich artist. And I remember early on, because they had kids working there, like myself, and some of the shifts we would get were 5 to 7. And I remember at a young age thinking, oh, I don't want to go to work. 5 to 7. 2 hours. But you know what propelled me? You got a free sub when you worked. You know, that propelled me. Like a boy driven by food, right? These guys weren't going to work very long. Just 1 hour. The master goes, these are people that nobody wants to hire. Do you understand? No one wants to hire them. The day is too late. They're passed over because they're not good workers according to the world's standards. Therefore, they go hungry. In the first century, there was no government nets of any sort. You just got left behind. There wasn't any sense in which mass amounts of people got together and said, let's help the suffering. That's what God's people were supposed to do. Actually, that's what we're supposed to be doing. If we did that, there would be much less of that goes on from the government realm. So he goes out to 5 p.m. and he says to them, he found others standing. He said to them, why do you stand here idle all day? Now, don't take that as that word idle there is not like, hey, you're lazy. Why are you standing around idle? Because how do we know that? Verse 7, they said to him, no one has hired us. Nobody wants us. We don't have any work because nobody wants us. We're not lazy. Nobody will take us. And oh, joy. Joy be that he says to them, you go into the vineyard too, and you trust me, I'll take care of you. I mean, you kind of get this. I mean, are you kind of catching you're getting some of the heavenly reality here? This isn't just about an earthly story. This is about a master who represents God. This is about laborers who represent those who come into the kingdom. And no matter what point you come in, it's all because of the kindness and mercy of God. Period. That's what he's trying to tell Peter, by the way. Because Peter and the boys get a little too lofty in their head, thinking we're the elite. Who's going to sit next to Jesus? And Jesus is like, I'm going to go die. You guys you're not getting it. And you know what? Sometimes I don't either. The laborers represent us. Those who are enlisted and saved at different times and seasons. And the master says, you go and work in my kingdom, in my vineyard. Now you think about that. All of us here who know Christ as their Savior. Maybe you're here this morning and you're searching and you haven't come to the Lord yet and you haven't realized that you need to surrender your life to Him. He has come to save you because you can't save yourself. You must surrender to Him and believe on Him and call on the name of the Lord and He will save you. For those of you that are saved here, we've all been saved at different seasons of life. Some, it was early in the morning, at the early stages of our life, maybe just a little child. For me, I was 9, 10 years old when I felt the weight of my sin. But I will tell you, I am reflecting upon that and to think that God would save a sinner like me. That God would allow me, who grew up around religious outward things like some of us have, and somehow still come to realize I'm bankrupt, I'm broken, I need Jesus. It doesn't matter what season, that should be our response. But those of us that were saved at different seasons, some of us were enlisted by the Master later on in life. Maybe in our later years or middle-aged years. And I think there's a sense in which that's represented in this parable. But yet all of us receive, the next part of this is the wages. What are the wages? Well, we could think of wages. Romans 3:23, for the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is what? Eternal life. So what wages do I get for being a sinner? Well, I get the payment of death unless somebody saves me. In walks Jesus. Now, that's not the wages that are going on here. The wages here represented is the free gift of eternal life. That each person, no matter when Jesus found you, that when you receive that pearl of great price, it doesn't matter when you were saved. You might have been saved in the 11th hour. But you want to know something? If you're going to be humble, you kind of got to realize we're kind of all 11th hour Christians. I mean, think of the ways in which you could have died before you came to Jesus. It was you right there. You could have missed it, and He saved you, and He enlisted you, and He brought you into His home. I was reading a commentary on this, and it was the pastor had served in Vietnam, and he said, before I came to Christ, I was in Vietnam, and I saw all the battle. I saw all of the things that I wish I never would have seen. I mean, all of the things of war. And he said, I think to myself, I wasn't saved until I came back, and how close I was to missing being saved. We're all, in a sense, 11th hour Christians, aren't we? And all of us are called to be busy with the time we have left. Each one of them worked. So now, as we think of the wages here, let's go on in the text. Verse 8, and when evening came, this was quite normal, so all of these people here in this story would have known it. When evening came, the master told the foreman, hey, gather up everybody, the day's over, sun's down, time to pay wages. I worked landscaping for a number of years. We never knew when we were getting off work, because that's the way landscaping is. So you had to embrace it or gripe about it. And when we were working long hours, I remember sometimes we'd get different workers at different times who weren't used to it. And I remember one time him saying to my boss, so when are we going to get done today? And the foreman looked at him and goes, you see that ball in the sky? When it goes all the way down. And we were just chuckling about it. But that's the way it was. Even in the first century, it's like, time's up. We don't know when we're going to get off when that sun goes down, when that big ball goes down. And when it went down, the evening came, the owner of the vineyard said, okay, call the foreman, line them up, whatever. Maybe it's a table. Everybody come get your wages. Call the laborers. But he does something very strange for payday. He pays them from those who were hired last, who worked the least, and then proceeds to pay those who were hired at 6 a.m. and worked the most. And there's a reason for that. He gives the order to have their wages paid, and he orders to pay them last to first. And as you look, when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the laborers, pay them their wages, that's a denarius, or whatever the master thought would be okay for those who didn't work a 12-hour day. That's what these workers are coming for. They're just, the guys at 6 a.m. are like, I know what I'm getting because it was promised to me. The other guys are like, I hope he's a nice guy. Hope he's generous. And so what he does is calls the laborers and he pays them their wages, beginning with the last. The first should be last, the last should be first. Okay. Pay them, beginning with last, up to the first. And in verse 9, and when those hired about the 11th hour, again, that's 5 p.m. They only worked 1 hour. Those hired the 11th hour, he gave each of them a denarius. He gave them a day's wage. And when those hired first came, they thought they would receive more. Now we see what's going on here is that The way Jesus presents the story is that those who were hired first were able to watch what the others were getting who didn't work as long as them. So the ones who worked 12 hours were standing there, high-minded, thinking, okay, we can kind of base what we're going to get from this guy or how generous he's going to be based on what he does here. So what joy in their minds, in their high-minded minds, when they saw that the guy who worked for 1 hour got an entire day's wage. Now, the minimum wage in Minnesota is about $11 an hour. If you work a 12-hour day, without all the taxes stuff, all that jazz, it's about $133. So that would be working 1 hour, making $133 an hour. They were paid $133 an hour. So when these others that work 12 hours, they're thinking, 133 times 12. Yes, we've hit the jackpot. They're so high-minded of look at what we've done compared to what they did. So he saw, and those that were hired first came. They thought in verse 10 that they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. He gave them all the same. Now, we could go on and on about this, but we live in a society where, it doesn't take a kid real long. We don't have to teach them these things. That's not fair. Did you ever have to teach your child that? Did you ever teach yourself that? We live in a society where it's like, we've heard some things like, Trump is going to bring us back to a merit-based society. And in an earthly sense, that makes sense. He says it's based on, your qualifications and your excellence and your intelligence when it comes for a job. On earth, that makes sense. In the kingdom, that's not how it works. You don't get in the kingdom because you're smarter. You don't get in the kingdom because you work longer. You don't get in the kingdom because you have a better degree than so-and-so. That's not how the kingdom works. All of us are sinners. No matter who you are, where you are, or what you've done. And all will receive mercy if they come to the Master. But how is the response of these last? In verse 11, on receiving it, then we see their response. The response in verse 11, on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." They're filing a complaint with HR. We can't take this. This is wrong. That's not fair. When you think of fairness, it's like, could you imagine a teacher gives 100% to everyone in the class, regardless of their grade and how much they studied and what they actually got on the test? Everybody gets an A. Well, the people who didn't study are like, yes! But the people who, stayed up all night. I remember going to seminary this time. My brother and I stayed up all night wandering around in this church, memorizing notes together to study for a test. To get there to only hear, everybody gets an A. That's not fair. Right? Jesus is drawing you into this story that you end up on the wrong side. Yeah, that's not fair. And then Jesus is going to say, yeah, because that's not how the kingdom works. You imagine a cop give everyone a ticket in the vehicle for speeding. Everybody's getting a ticket for speeding. I didn't drive. Don't care. That's not fair. Every kid at the tournament gets a trophy and is treated as if they've won the tournament. And the kids who won are like, that's not fair. But the kids who didn't are like, sweet. An employer gives everyone the same bonus regardless of performance. Share the love. No, that's not fair. See, on earth, that's one thing. In the kingdom, it's quite another. And what the response here of the laborers shows their heart, that they don't see that the master is kind and he's loving. They don't look at the workers as people who actually need help. They just see what they got versus what other people got. And so they start to grumble. They grumbled at the master. And it's interesting because that Greek word the word itself sounds like grumbling. And so they grumbled, and someone's a ringleader. There always is a ringleader among the grumblers. And he got brave enough to speak. These last worked only an hour, and you've made them equal to us. This is ridiculous. But in verse 13, the master said, "Friend, I didn't do you any wrong." There's questions. Question number one is, "Friend, I didn't do you any wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius?" I didn't do anything wrong to you. Take what belongs to you, verse 14, and go. I chose to give this last worker as I give you. Verse 15, am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? Do you not care about other people? You just care about yourself and the fact that you got here first. They don't. They're missing it. And again, just to bring you back to it, he's rebuking the disciples to some degree to say, listen, I know you've been walking with me. I know you got here first, but that's not how this works. I'm asking you to love me. And all these other people need the very same thing that I'm giving to you, and guess what? You didn't deserve it. I came and found you, Peter. I said, follow me, and you followed me. You didn't do anything to deserve any place or position. It was just my grace. So you catching the heavenly reality? The master is representing God, of course. The laborers represent us who come into the kingdom. The wages represent the eternal life that God has given us. That is what must fuel our joy and our gratitude. That's why I want to work like a dog for Jesus. Well, because I'm going to be better. No. When I think about what Jesus has done for me, it just drives me to want to work hard for Him, to love Him more, to serve Him more, to not waste my time away doing something stupid that just doesn't mean anything. Yes, there's a time and place for things and relaxation, but I still want to work like a dog for Jesus, to give Him my all because He gave me His all. And so the day is coming to a close, and Jesus gives this story, and then He says, so the last will be first, and the first will be last. You don't have to hyperanalyze that. It's all about humility. The first are those who think they deserve because of who they think they are and what they've done. The last are the humble who just simply trust the grace of the Master to do what is right. And grace is it's a free kindness of God given to us through Jesus Christ. And so all the way back to it, kingdom work must be driven by the joy of receiving God's free grace. Everybody worked. Everyone was brought into the kingdom at different times. But we're all working for the same master. We're all working in the same field. I recently talked to our missionary who's over in Brazil. And he's in his 80s now, but he's just still working like a dog for Jesus because he just loves Jesus. It's contagious. I love talking to him. His entire life is gripped by, I must find another soul who needs Jesus. It's contagious. And what joy to know that, like, I'm working in here and he's there, but yet we're all working in the same field, seeking to bring more laborers. Maybe if there were some humble among the workers in this story who thought, isn't it so kind that even though we worked all day, that the master saw that the 11th hour worker didn't have anything, and I know they got 3 kids, and they can't seem to figure out how they're going to support him, and there was no hope for him, and our master, our boss is so good he brought him in. I'm so grateful. Hopefully there were some others who weren't grumblers, who just said, so grateful. So grateful that God saved you. He saved you? Yeah, He saved me. Here's when He saved me. When did He save you? Oh, just recently? That is awesome. I'm so excited what God's doing in your life. And for some of you here, that's true. But when we think of stewardship related to this parable, are you driven? I want to just give you these 3 questions as we close up together. 3 stewardship questions from this parable. What are some things that we can take away about stewardship? Well, the master owned everything. Did you catch that? So the master of a house owned all this stuff. Represents God. He owns everything. There isn't a part of your life that isn't owned by God, whether you want to admit it or not. And I will have to give an accounting for how I have handled His stuff. And so the master owns it all. He brought me into His kingdom. Why? To do my own little side gig? No, to work for Him. Not because I'm earning His grace, but because I've received it through Jesus. So question number 1, have you answered the call of the master? The master is the one who went out looking for people. The story does not say the workers were banging on the master's door at 6 a.m., waking him up, get out of bed, will you hire us? No, it was the master who took the initiative to go get workers. And they had to answer that call. Have you answered the call of the master? Maybe you know about Jesus, but maybe you have yet to answer the call of the master. To surrender your life and say, I've been working for myself, been capital S-E-L-F, self-employed for most of my life, and I'm giving it up. I'm done. Will you save me, Jesus? And He will. He's calling out to you now. God calls out to all sinners to repent and believe the gospel. God specifically draws believers, it says in John 6, to receive specifically that call. So if you've answered the call of that Master, then it leads us to the second question. Are you focused on grumbling or gratitude? When you think of the stewardship even of this church and being part of this church started, if some of you are visitors here, this church started in 1905, right, by a Czech missionary who came here and started a work of the ministry here when there really was no gospel presence. And when you get part of a church, I think one of the things that I've observed growing up in this church that really I myself could do if I wanted to have that grumbling mindset is, hey, I was here first. This is my church. Welcome to my church. Wow, that's terrible. That's exactly the opposite of what Jesus is teaching us in this parable. I've read some things on church and local church, and some people believe they have squatters' rights in the church. You know what squatters' rights are? I've been sitting in this pew. I've been paying, and therefore, Pastor, you must, or my vote gets more. No, there's no squatters' rights in the church. I don't care if you just got saved yesterday and you brought in the membership of the church. Welcome to a family of Christ that loves one another and cares about each other and shares and helps you understand that there is no levels in this church, just sinners saved by grace. But these workers were grumbling. They were looking around at other people. They were pampering their flesh and their pride by looking down at other people and saying, yeah, I worked hard today. You see this sweat right here? Got sweat running down right here. See this dirt? I remember after a day, the shower was just like black because we laid sod and we were playing in the dirt all day. It's like, you see all that dirt? Yeah, I've been here. Get in line. No, that's not how the church works. The world works like that, not here. So are you focused on grumbling? That has to do with our idea of like, are we grateful or what are we doing this kingdom stuff for? Because gratitude, as my gratitude increases for my love for the Lord and what He's done for me, you know what should also increase? My desire to please Him and love Him and do actual tangible things with the resources He's given me to love those that He's calling and enlisting into the kingdom. Are you grumbling? Or are you grateful? Now, the third question, which is hopefully, well, that's not covered up on there. Okay, just the TV. The third question is, does your kingdom work ethic need attention? What's your work ethic? You ever been in a job where as soon as the boss is gone, the workers start doing weird stuff? Like not working. You ever notice that? I remember noticing that landscaping. It was like when the boss was on the job site, it was like, oh, back to digging holes. As soon as he's gone, it's like, hey, here's a bird. What's your kingdom work ethic? A work ethic is a person's, if you just look it up, the definition is a person's set of values and attitudes towards their work, characterized by qualities of dedication, reliability, and responsibility, hard work, and commitment. Wow, we could talk about that related to the kingdom. What is my kingdom work ethic? Am I characterized by a person who is like, these aren't my resources. This isn't my time. This isn't my talent. This is God's. What does He want me to do with this? But sometimes we can get real lazy in the kingdom work ethic, can't we? We get focused on the here and now, or maybe we get lost sight and we start wandering into another field. We call that idolatry. If I wander into another field and I start working for another master for a little while, that's idolatry. I'm not worshiping the Lord anymore. I'm worshiping something other than Him. And so now my resources have been turned toward this earthly thing that I think is going to give me pleasure, but it's just going to end up falling flat. And then you come back. So which kingdom work ethic? Does it need attention? Maybe you need to be reminded of Matthew 9, verse 36, when Jesus saw the crowds. So Jesus sees all these mass amount of people, and He had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. That's what I was before I came to Jesus. I was just running around with no shepherd. And you know what was going to happen? I was going to die. Because that's what happens to a sheep with no shepherd. But then he turns to his disciples and he says, the harvest is plentiful, but what? The laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers. That's you. That's me. So does your kingdom work ethic need attention? What are you doing with your time, your talent, your treasure? He deserves the gratitude that you owe him for what he's done for you. It's not about a slavish fear. It's about a love that is driven by God's unconditional grace. Now, I'm going to close this sermon the way a sermon closed 160 years ago by a faithful preacher. And he ended his sermon like this in 1865. He says, I pray you, brethren, suffer no idleness to creep over you. If you have sought to extend the Redeemer's kingdom, do it more. Give more. Talk more of Christ. Pray more. Labor more. Then the preacher says, I often have people tell me, Pastor, do less. You need to do less. He says, I cannot do less. Do less? Why, I would rather rot altogether than live the inglorious life of doing less than our utmost for God. We shall, none of us, I'm afraid, kill ourselves with working too hard for Jesus. You're not going to kill yourself working too hard for Jesus. Promise you. He goes on to say, work for the master. Labor for the master. We must spend and be spent and wear ourselves out for Jesus. Make no reserve for the flesh to fulfill the lusts of it. And oh, how happy shall we be if we may be privileged to finish the work and hear him say, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord. May the Lord bless you for Christ's sake. Amen. Let's pray together.